The flowers were white roses. I remember that detail more than anything else. Hundreds of them, arranged in perfect arches along the aisle, their petals so pristine they almost looked artificial. The kind of flowers you order when you want a wedding to look like a photograph. The kind of flowers that say we planned this carefully. We thought of everything. The venue was a converted estate just outside the city. Vaulted ceilings, stained glass, afternoon light pouring in like something out of a painting. There were at least 300 guests seated in gilded chairs, dressed in their finest, murmuring to each other in that warm, expectant way people do when they believe they are about to witness something beautiful. The string quartet was playing. The officiant was smiling. And the groom was standing at the altar in a charcoal suit, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes glistening. The picture of a man who believed this was the happiest day of his life. I was sitting in the fourth row. I had been there for over an hour. Long enough to watch the ushers seat the families. Long enough to watch the bridesmaids float down the aisle in champagne-colored dresses. Long enough to accept a glass of water from a passing server, take a slow sip, and set it down without my hand trembling once. People around me were dabbing their eyes before the bride even appeared. I was completely still. And then she walked through those doors, ivory dress, veil catching the light, the kind of entrance that pulls the breath from every room she enters, and the guests rose to their feet, and the music swelled, and I rose with them. I watched her walk toward him. I watched him watch her. And at the precise moment the officiant opened his mouth to begin, I stood up. What happened next stopped the ceremony cold. 300 people fell silent in under 4 seconds. I counted. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what I did on that wedding day, you need to understand what was done to me first. You need to understand the kind of trust that was built between 3 people over years, real, bone-deep trust, and exactly how it was dismantled, piece by piece, while I smiled and said nothing. This isn't a story about heartbreak. Heartbreak is something that happens to you. This is a story about what happens when you decide to stop letting things happen to you. Let me take you back to the beginning. I met Marcus when I was 9 years old. His family had just moved into the apartment 2 floors above ours, and the first thing he ever said to me was that my bicycle was the wrong color. I told him his opinion was unsolicited. We were best friends by the end of the week. That's the thing about certain people, they enter your life with a kind of inevitability that makes it impossible to imagine the version of yourself that never knew them. Marcus was that person for me. We grew up in the same cramped neighborhood, attended the same underfunded schools, wore the same brand of cheap sneakers and told ourselves we were going to be different one day. Not rich, necessarily. Just different. Just free. We kept every promise we made to each other on those streets. When my father left, Marcus slept on our couch for 2 weeks without being asked, just so I wouldn't be alone in the apartment with my mother's grief. When Marcus lost his first job at 23 and couldn't make rent, I covered him for 3 months and never once mentioned it again. That was the unspoken contract between us. Not friendship. Brotherhood. The kind you don't apply for and can't resign from. He was the first person I called after every major moment of my adult life. Every promotion, every setback, every decision I wasn't sure about. His number was at the top of my contacts not because of alphabetical order, but because that's where he belonged. Which is why, when I met Simone, Marcus was the second person to know. I met her at a rooftop gathering on a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of event where you only go because a coworker guilts you into it. I was standing near the railing with a drink I hadn't touched, watching the city lights, genuinely considering leaving early, when she appeared beside me and said, without preamble, that I looked like someone who had somewhere better to be. She was right. But I stayed. We talked for 4 hours that night. About everything and nothing, cities we'd left, habits we couldn't break, the strange grief of outgrowing old versions of yourself. She had this way of listening that made you feel like the most considered person in the room. And she laughed at the precise right moments, which sounds like a small thing until you realize how rare it actually is. I called Marcus from the parking garage at midnight. He listened to me talk about her for 45 minutes. At the end, he said, "Sounds like you're done for." He was laughing when he said it. So was I. He wasn't wrong. Simone and I dated for 2 years before I proposed. Marcus knew before I bought the ring. He helped me choose it, stood beside me in the jewelry store on a rainy Saturday, squinting at the display case with the seriousness of a man selecting something that would outlast him. He told me to get the one with the simple band. "She doesn't seem like someone who needs anything to announce itself," he said. I proposed on a Tuesday. Nothing elaborate, the restaurant where we had our first real date, a table by the window, the ring in my jacket pocket for the entire meal while my heart tried to exit my chest. When I finally asked, she looked at me for a long moment before she answered. Then she said yes. The first call I made was to my mother. The second was to Marcus. He picked up on the first ring, like he'd been waiting. And when I told him, he let out this long breath, almost like relief. And said, "It's about time, brother. It's about time." He was the best man before I even officially asked. There is one other thing I remember from that evening, a detail I filed away without understanding its weight until much later. After I hung up the phone, Simone came to stand beside me at the window. She was looking at her ring in the city light. And she said, almost to herself, "I should call Marcus. He'll want to know." At the time, I thought it was sweet. She called him before I'd even put my phone back in my pocket. And Marcus, who I had just spoken to 60 seconds earlier, answered immediately. It was a Wednesday. I remember because I had a standing work call every Wednesday evening at 7, and I had left the apartment at 6:45 in a hurry, already running through the agenda in my head. I was 3 blocks away when I reached into my jacket pocket and found nothing. My phone was on the kitchen counter. I turned around. That's the entire hinge of everything that followed, a forgotten phone, 3 blocks, a turned around. The smallest possible sequence of events. The kind of thing that happens to everyone and means nothing. Except that night, it meant everything. It was raining lightly by the time I reached the building. I didn't bother with the elevator, just took the stairs, still mentally on the call I was going to be late for, key already in my hand before I reached the door. And then I heard her voice. I stopped. Not because of the sound itself, but because of the quality of it. Simone had many voices. The warm one she used with her mother, the professional one she wore to client meetings, the soft one she reserved for moments between just the two of us. I knew every register. What I heard through that door was none of them. This was something unguarded. Something that had never been performed for me. I stood completely still with my key an inch from the lock. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she said. "Being in this apartment. Sleeping in this bed. Pretending." A pause. Then Marcus's voice, low, certain, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this, 6 more weeks. "That's all. Just until we have everything in place. 6 weeks feels like a lifetime. I know. But we do this right, or we don't do it at all." Another pause. Longer. Then, "I love you." And Marcus said, "I love you too. I've loved you since the night he introduced us." I don't know how long I stood there. Time stopped functioning the way it's supposed to. The rain was still falling. Somewhere below me, a car horn sounded. The world continued its ordinary business while mine collapsed inward, silently, like a building whose supports had been removed one by one over a long period and had finally, in a single quiet moment, ceased to hold. I did not kick the door in. I did not raise my voice. I did not do any of the things a man is supposed to do in that moment. I lowered my key. I turned around. I walked back down the stairs with the same measured steps I had used on the way up. I pushed through the lobby door into the rain and I stood on the pavement for a while, getting wet, until my breathing returned to something regular. Then I walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat and stared through the windshield at the rain. My phone was still on the kitchen counter. I left it there. The call could wait. What I needed, in that moment, was to sit with what I now knew. And to decide very carefully what I was going to do about it. I made that decision before the rain stopped. The dinner was 2 nights later. Simone had arranged it weeks in advance, her parents, my mother, Marcus, a restaurant we all liked. A celebration dinner, ostensibly, for the engagement. I had thought about canceling. I had sat with that option for the better part of 48 hours, turning it over, examining it from every angle. I decided against it. I arrived 7 minutes late, which was normal for me. I hugged Simone at the door, and she hugged me back with the same warmth she always had, and I felt absolutely nothing, not anger, not grief, nothing. Just a clean, clinical observation, she is very good at this. I shook Marcus's hand and clapped him on the shoulder the way I always did, and he grinned at me and said I looked tired. I told him work had been brutal. We ordered wine. We toasted the engagement. I said something that made the table laugh and watched Marcus laugh with them. Head thrown back, completely at ease, and I thought, you have no idea what is coming. That thought was the first moment I felt something other than emptiness. It was not grief. It was focus. I won't pretend the performance was effortless. There was one evening, about 3 weeks in, when Simone reached across the couch and took my hand while we were watching something on television, a completely ordinary gesture, one she had made 1,000 times. And the familiarity of it hit me in a way I hadn't anticipated. For about 4 seconds, something threatened to surface. My jaw tightened. I felt it coming. I excused myself to get a glass of water. I stood at the kitchen sink for 2 minutes, running the tap, until it passed. Then I went back to the couch and put my arm around her. That was the closest I came to breaking. After that, something calcified in me. The grief didn't disappear, it went somewhere else. It compressed into something smaller and denser and considerably more useful. I started paying attention differently. Marcus had always been careless with his phone around me, because why wouldn't he be? I was his best friend. I had no reason to look. But now I noticed things, the way he angled the screen when a message arrived, the slight pause before he'd pocket it when I entered a room, the specific brightness that crossed his face right before he claimed he needed to use the bathroom. I noticed the way Simone talked about the wedding venue, too much detail, too much investment, for someone who was supposedly just helping plan my wedding. She knew the catering coordinator's first name. She had opinions about centerpieces. I noticed that when Marcus offered to handle the wedding invitations, save you the hassle, brother, Simone agreed before I'd even responded. Piece by piece, the shape of the thing revealed itself. This was not a moment of weakness between two people who had made a terrible mistake. This was architecture. This had walls and a foundation and a timeline. And somewhere underneath all of it, I began to suspect, was something that went far beyond the emotional. Something that involved money. I kept smiling. I kept laughing at Marcus's jokes. I kept holding Simone's hand at family dinners and saying, when her mother asked, that yes, I was the happiest I had ever been. And every single night, I went home and I wrote down everything I had seen. The financial records came first. I want to be precise about how I found them, because the how matters. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't spiraling through Simone's belongings looking for evidence of something I already suspected. What I was doing was something far more mundane. I was looking for our joint savings account statement, the one we had opened 8 months earlier to begin setting aside money for a house deposit. I logged into the account on a Tuesday morning before work. The balance was $43. I sat with that number for a long time. The account had held just under $60,000 the last time I had checked, which I now realized with a cold and specific clarity had been almost 5 months ago. I had trusted Simone to manage the transfers. She had insisted on it, "You handle enough at work, let me take care of this," and I had agreed, because that was the kind of trust we had built, or the kind of trust one believed we had built. I did not call her. I called a private financial investigator instead. A woman named Diane, referred to me quietly by a colleague whose divorce had been complicated. I told Diane I needed discretion and documentation. She told me those were her 2 best qualities. What Diane found over the following 6 weeks reframed every single moment of the previous 2 years. The $60,000 had been moved in increments. Careful, measured withdrawals and transfers, never large enough to trigger an automatic alert, spread across 4 months. It had been routed through 2 intermediary accounts before landing in a joint account I had never seen, held in the names of Marcus and Simone. A joint account opened 14 months ago. 14 months. We had been engaged for 18. I remember the exact moment Diane sent me the documentation. I was sitting in my car in a parking structure after work, and I opened the email on my phone, and I scrolled through the attachments with the methodical patience of a man who has already emotionally prepared himself for the worst. The worst was still worse than I had prepared for. Because the account wasn't just a holding place for stolen savings. There were other deposits, regular ones, going back nearly 2 years. Consulting fees, the statements called them. Paid by a shell company that, after another week of Diane's work, traced back to Marcus. He had been paying her. Not recently. Not since they fell into something accidental and regrettable. He had been paying her for 22 months. Which meant that before I ever proposed, before I ever chose that ring, before I ever stood in that restaurant with my heart trying to escape my chest, this had already been in motion. Simone had not fallen for my best friend. She had been placed in my life by him. I sat in that parking structure for a very long time after I understood that. The city moved around me, indifferent and continuous. I thought about the rooftop where I met her. I thought about Marcus's voice on the phone that night, "Sounds like you're done for," and I understood now that he had been laughing for an entirely different reason than I thought. I thought about the $60,000. I thought about the house we were supposed to buy together. And I thought about what I was going to do. I already knew the answer. This would not end quietly. I gave myself 1 week to feel it. That's all I allowed. 7 days to sit with the full weight of what had been done, the scope of it, the duration of it, the specific cruelty of the detail. 7 days to grieve not just the relationship and the friendship, but the version of myself that had believed in both without question. On the 8th day, I opened a new document on my laptop and I began to build the case. Diane had given me the financial documentation. Account records, transfer histories, the paper trail that connected Marcus's shell company to the payments made to Simone across 22 months. I organized everything chronologically. I created a timeline that began with the night I met Simone on that rooftop and ended with the most recent bank statement showing $43 in an account that should have held our future. I printed 3 copies. One for myself. One for Diane. One for the attorney I quietly retained. A man named Gerald, who specialized in financial fraud and had the particular gift of being completely unreadable in conversation. Gerald reviewed the documentation and used the word prosecutable within the first 15 minutes. He told me I had options and asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told him I needed 60 more days. He looked at me carefully and said, "You're not going to do anything that creates a liability for yourself, are you?" I told him I was going to attend a wedding. Gerald was the only person who knew the full picture. I had chosen him precisely because his obligation was to me and his discretion was professional and absolute. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell mutual friends. I did not tell a single person in the overlapping world that Marcus and I shared, because that world had edges, and edges leaked. I watched them send the wedding invitations. I received mine on a Thursday. A thick cream envelope, my name in calligraphy, the date embossed in gold. The wedding of Marcus and Simone. I set it on my kitchen counter and looked at it for a moment, then propped it against the fruit bowl like a man who had simply received a piece of mail. I RSVP'd the following morning. One guest. Attending. With pleasure. The reason I chose the wedding, the specific, deliberate reason I waited for that day and no other, was because 300 people would be present. 300 witnesses. Both families. Every person in their lives who believed in the story they had constructed. In a quiet confrontation, they could deny. They could reframe. They could control the aftermath. In a room of 300 people, with documentation, there was no version of events they could construct fast enough. The night before the wedding I sat on my balcony for a long time. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that, because anger would have made me imprecise, and imprecision would have made me manageable. What I felt was something closer to resolution, the specific, settled calm of a man who has already done the hardest part, which is deciding. I went to bed at 10:30. I slept without interruption. In the morning, I put on my best suit, picked up the envelope on my kitchen counter, the one with 3 copies of every document Diane had found. And I drove to the most beautiful venue I had ever seen. I took my seat in the 4th row. And I waited. Marcus looked happy. That was the first thing I noticed when I arrived, not the venue, not the flowers, not the 300 guests moving through the entrance hall in their finest clothes. It was Marcus, standing near the groom's room with 2 of his cousins, laughing at something, completely unburdened. The laugh I had heard 10,000 times. The laugh of a man without a single weight on his conscience. I shook hands with people I knew. I accepted a program from an usher. I found my seat in the 4th row, center, unobstructed sightline to the altar, and I set my jacket carefully across my lap, the envelope beneath it, and I waited with the patience of someone who has been waiting for 6 months and can afford another hour. The venue filled around me. I watched Simone's mother take her seat in the front row, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes before the ceremony had even begun. I watched Marcus's father straighten his tie 3 times. I watched mutual friends file in, people who had attended our engagement dinner, people who had hugged Simone and called her perfect for me, and I noted that none of them had thought to question how quickly she had moved from my life to his. People see what they are shown. The quartet began. The bridesmaids proceeded. Every head in the room turned toward the aisle with that collective held breath that precedes a bride's entrance, and then the doors opened, and Simone appeared. She was devastating in white. I say that without bitterness and without sentiment. It is simply the accurate word. She moved down that aisle with the composed grace of a woman who had choreographed this moment in her mind long before today, and the room responded the way rooms do, with exhaled wonder, with tears, with the universal human weakness for a beautiful image. I watched Marcus watch her. And I stood when everyone stood, and I sat when everyone sat, and I listened as the officiant welcomed 300 people to the union of 2 individuals who had, between them, stolen $60,000, 22 months, and something that cannot be assigned a number from the man sitting in the 4th row. The officiant reached the moment every ceremony builds toward. If anyone present knows of any reason these 2 should not be joined in marriage. He had barely finished the sentence. I stood up. The room shifted before I said a single word. That's the thing about silence in a crowded space, it has a texture. 300 people turning in unison creates a particular quality of stillness that is almost physical. I felt it settle over the room like a held breath. I said, clearly and without elevation, I do. I know a reason. Someone gasped. Someone else said my name, I don't know who. At the altar, Marcus had gone very still. Simone's bouquet trembled once, then stopped, as though she had commanded her own hands. I reached into the envelope. 14 months before this wedding, I said, while Simone was engaged to me, she and Marcus opened a joint bank account. Over the following months, $60,000 was transferred from the savings account Simone and I held together, money we set aside for a home, into that account. I have the bank records. I held up the first document. Marcus funded this through a shell company that had been paying Simone a monthly fee for 22 months. Payments that began 4 months before I ever met her. I held up the second. She was not placed in my life by accident. The silence that followed was the most complete silence I have ever stood inside. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of 300 people simultaneously suspending the ability to speak. Then Simone's mother said, "What?" Just that one word, barely audible, and the room fractured. Marcus moved first. He stepped forward from the altar with his hands raised, and he said my name in the voice he used when he needed to manage a situation, and he said, "Brother, listen," and I looked at him with an expression I had been composing for 6 months and said, very quietly, "Don't." He stopped. Simone did not attempt a denial. She stood at the altar in her ivory dress with her bouquet at her side and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not guilt, not defiance, but something closer to relief, as though a weight she had been carrying since the beginning had finally, in this terrible public moment, been set down. I placed the remaining documents on the front pew. Then I buttoned my jacket, excused myself past the guests in my row, and walked back up the aisle I had never walked down. Behind me, the room came apart. I was in my car before the crying started. I know this because I sat in the parking area for a few minutes before pulling away, and I could hear it, muffled through the estate walls, the specific sound of a celebration collapsing into something else. Raised voices. A woman, I believe it was Simone's mother, calling a name repeatedly. The string quartet, to their credit, had apparently stopped. I drove home in complete quiet. No music. No calls. I changed out of my suit, made coffee, and sat on my balcony for the rest of the afternoon watching the city. My phone did not stop for 4 hours. Gerald called the following Monday. The financial documentation I had left on that front pew had been photographed by approximately 11 guests before the venue staff had the presence of mind to collect it. It had been shared before the end of the day. Gerald informed me that Marcus had already retained a lawyer, which he said was a reliable indicator that a man knows he has done something worth defending. The civil case was filed 6 weeks later. Marcus settled out of court 9 months after the wedding that never completed. The settlement recovered the $60,000 in full, along with legal costs and an additional amount I was advised not to disclose publicly. Gerald called it a favorable outcome. I called it accurate. The shell company was dissolved. The joint account was frozen during proceedings. Whether criminal charges followed is a matter I've chosen to leave in Gerald's hands and not in this story, because frankly, the legal mechanics were never the point. Mutual friends divided the way mutual friends always do when a shared world breaks apart, some with heat and loyalty, some with the quiet, unsatisfying neutrality of people who cannot afford to choose. A few reached out to tell me they had always sensed something was wrong. I thanked them without believing them. Simone moved away within the year. I don't know where. I didn't look. Marcus, the man who slept on my couch when my father left, who stood beside me in a jewelry store and told me to get the simple band, who said it's about time, brother when I told him she said yes, Marcus I have not spoken to since I said don't at an altar, and I do not expect that to change. My life in the months that followed was quieter than it had ever been, and I mean that without self-pity. I recalibrated. I slept well. I spent more time on my balcony than I probably should have and less time explaining myself to other people than I ever had before. Something about going through what I went through, not the betrayal itself, but the 6 months of knowing and choosing stillness over reaction, had permanently altered my tolerance for noise that doesn't matter. I trust carefully now. That sounds like damage. I prefer to think of it as precision. Here is the only thing I want to leave you with. There is a version of this story where I kicked that apartment door open on a rainy Wednesday evening. Where I said everything I felt the moment I felt it. Where I gave them the gift of knowing I was broken, which would have made me manageable, which would have allowed them to construct a response while I was still bleeding. I did not give them that gift. I waited. I documented. I chose the room, the moment, the audience. And when the officiant asked if anyone knew a reason, I answered him honestly. 300 witnesses. No room for revision. The flowers were white roses. I remember thinking, when I finally drove away, that they really were beautiful.